Dear John, Chapter 1. John Scott hadn't expected much when he opened the dusty attic that morning. He had only ventured up there at the insistence of his wife, Sarah, who was pushing him to clean out the clutter before their first child arrived. The attic, with its slanted beams and musty smell of old wood, had never interested him much. He had always found attics unsettling, but Sarah had insisted they finally get it organized. Their house was old, with wooden beams that groaned with the weather. The attic, filled with forgotten memories and worn boxes, felt like a world away from the life he and Sarah were building downstairs. John sifted through a pile of old magazines and books, his mind wandering to the growing list of things to do before the baby arrived. The baby. He smiled, thinking of Sarah and her glowing face, now rounder with the late stages of pregnancy. He opened a weathered box labeled "Old Stuff" in his own handwriting, an attempt at organizing from years ago. Inside, layers of yellowed newspapers and a stack of postcards from trips he barely remembered. His fingers grazed a stiff envelope hidden beneath the clutter. The paper felt fresh, out of place among the musty relics. John pulled it free and frowned at what he saw. It was a simple envelope, but it was pristine, as if it had been tucked away recently. There was no dust on it, and the writing on the front was in a familiar hand. His hand. But it wasn't his current handwriting, it looked older, shakier, as if written in a hurry. To John Scott, read carefully, the words were scrawled with an urgency that sent a ripple of unease through him. He turned the envelope over in his hands, searching for a sign of where it came from or who had put it there. But the attic was silent, save for the soft creaking of the house settling. John, Sarah's voice echoed up the stairs, pulling him from his thoughts. Did you find the photo albums? He blinked, suddenly aware of how long he'd been standing there with the envelope in his hands. Not yet, he called back. Give me a few minutes. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore the envelope open. A single sheet of paper fell into his palm, neatly folded and impossibly clean. He hesitated for a moment before unfolding it, his heart beating just a little faster than usual. Something about this felt wrong. Dear John, this is not a prank. It's important you believe everything I'm about to tell you, even though you'll want to dismiss it. I am you, from the future. And this letter, well, it's a warning. John stared at the words, trying to process what he was reading. His future self. A warning. He read it again, slower this time, letting the weight of the message sink in. In exactly 6 months, something will happen that changes your life forever. At first, it will seem small, insignificant, like a minor choice you make in the spur of the moment. But trust me, it isn't. You must not take the offer that comes from a man named Peter Brooks. Decline it, no matter how tempting it seems. This is the only chance you'll have to avoid the mistake I made. The name Peter Brooks was unfamiliar to him, but the sense of unease gnawing at him only deepened. Who was Peter Brooks? Why was his future self warning him about some offer? He scanned the next lines quickly. If you accept, it will begin a chain of events you can't control, and it won't end well. I can't tell you the details. I can't explain why. All I can say is that your entire future depends on it. This letter is your only warning. Don't let it happen. John's mouth went dry as he read the final line. The handwriting became shakier, more frantic. You'll know what I mean when the time comes. There was no signature, only that cryptic closing. No further explanations, no answers to the million questions suddenly swarming in his mind. He stood there for a moment, paralyzed by the impossibility of what he was holding. A letter, written in his own hand, warning him about a man he had never met. The letter trembled slightly in his hands. Could this be some kind of elaborate prank? But who could have done it? The attic had been locked, untouched for years. And yet, here it was. John was snapped out of his daze by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. John, Sarah's voice floated up again. Everything okay? You've been up there a while. He swallowed hard, quickly folding the letter back into the envelope and stuffing it into his back pocket. He didn't know why, but something in him didn't want Sarah to see it. At least, not yet. Yeah, he called back, trying to keep his voice steady. Just going through some stuff. His heart was still racing as he made his way down the stairs. When he reached the bottom, Sarah was standing in the hallway, rubbing her belly absent-mindedly, her expression soft with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You find those photo albums?" she asked, raising an eyebrow as she glanced at the empty space in his hands. John forced a smile, feeling the weight of the envelope against his leg. "Not yet. I'll take another look later." Sarah studied him for a moment, her gaze lingering just a little longer than usual. He could tell she sensed something was off. "You've been up there a while. Everything okay?" "Yeah," he lied, avoiding her eyes. "Just got caught up in some old memories." She smiled, but the concern didn't fully leave her face. "All right, just don't forget, we still have to get the nursery finished this weekend. My mom's coming by tomorrow to help with the baby stuff." John nodded absently, his thoughts already drifting back to the attic. "I won't forget." As Sarah headed into the kitchen, John found himself standing there, feeling the letter burning in his pocket. He needed time to think, to process what he had just read. For the rest of the day, he tried to push the letter out of his mind, focusing on assembling the new crib, organizing the baby clothes, and making dinner with Sarah. But every time he found a moment alone, his thoughts drifted back to the attic, to the envelope, to the impossible message it contained. When Sarah finally went to bed that night, John stayed up, staring at the envelope on the kitchen table. He opened it again, reading the letter over and over, hoping to find some clue, some explanation that would make sense of it all. But no matter how many times he read it, the warning was clear. Don't take the offer. Chapter 2. The next few days passed in a blur of ordinary tasks, but John couldn't shake the feeling that everything was on the verge of falling apart. The letter burned in his pocket like a guilty secret, and he caught himself glancing at it during quiet moments when Sarah wasn't looking. She had noticed something was off, but he kept deflecting her concerns with excuses about work stress and the baby preparations. Every time she asked him if everything was okay, he smiled and reassured her. The truth was, the letter had changed something inside him. It was as if, by reading those words, his life had taken a sharp turn down a path he didn't understand yet. Peter Brooks. A man he'd never met, but now, thanks to the warning from his future self, John felt like he was being hunted by the very idea of him. A week after finding the letter, John noticed the first sign. He was sitting at his desk, going through some work emails, trying to focus on the mountain of paperwork that had been piling up. His job had always been demanding, but now, with Sarah's pregnancy and the weight of the letter in his pocket, the pressure felt unbearable. As he scrolled through his inbox, something caught his eye. An unfamiliar subject line, "Opportunity for consultation, Peter Brooks." John froze. It was there, staring at him, that name he had never heard of until the letter. His fingers trembled as he moved the mouse, hesitating over the email. He hadn't heard of Peter Brooks before the letter, but now, here he was, emailing him about a consultation opportunity. His heart raced, and a wave of nausea hit him. Was this it? Was this the offer his future self had warned him about? Should he even open it? His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them felt good. The message in the letter rang in his head like a siren. Decline it, no matter how tempting it seems. John stared at the email for what felt like hours, debating whether to click on it. His future self had been adamant, don't take the offer. But curiosity gnawed at him. What if it was nothing? What if it was just a coincidence? His hand hovered over the mouse. He could just click once. Just read the email. That wouldn't be accepting anything, right? It would just be gathering information. That wouldn't hurt. But before he could make a decision, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah. He glanced at the message. "Hey, just finished at the doctor's. Everything's good with the baby. Can you pick up some groceries on your way home? Love you." The normalcy of Sarah's text snapped him out of his trance. He quickly closed the email without reading it, heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't deal with this right now. He needed to focus on Sarah, on the baby. The email could wait. Later that evening, John sat across from Sarah at the dinner table. The house was quiet, and the usual conversation about the baby or their plans for the weekend felt forced. Sarah was picking at her food, glancing at him with a worried expression. John, she said finally, setting down her fork. You've been distracted lately. Is everything all right? John forced a smile, the weight of the letter and the unopened email from Peter Brooks pressing down on him. Yeah, just work stuff, he said, trying to keep his tone light. You know how it is. But Sarah wasn't buying it. She leaned forward slightly, her brow furrowed. This isn't just work, I can tell. You've been distant, even more than usual. You can talk to me, you know. We're in this together. The guilt gnawed at him. He wanted to tell her everything, to show her the letter, to confess how terrified he was that this stranger, Peter Brooks, was somehow connected to their future. But the words caught in his throat. What would he even say? How could he explain something so impossible without sounding crazy? Instead, he gave her the same empty reassurances. I'm fine, really. She didn't look convinced. Her eyes lingered on him for a long moment before she sighed and pushed her plate away. I don't want you to shut me out. Especially with the baby coming. I need you here. Her words cut through him like a knife. She wasn't just talking about the physical presence, he knew that. She was talking about the emotional distance, the gap that had grown between them since he found the letter. I'm here, he said, though even he could hear the lie in his own voice. His mind drifted back to when they had first found out about the pregnancy. It had been a surprise, but a happy one. They had talked about starting a family, but it had always seemed like something in the distant future. But when Sarah had told him the news, holding the positive pregnancy test with a mixture of excitement and nerves, John had felt an overwhelming sense of joy. It was the start of something new, something incredible. He remembered how they had spent the next few days in a daze of excitement, picking out baby names, talking about the future. It had felt like the beginning of the happiest chapter of their lives. But now, as he lay there in the dark, the joy had been replaced by a gnawing fear that everything was slipping away. The letter had changed everything. He couldn't ignore the feeling that the world he had built with Sarah was on the verge of collapsing, and it was all tied to Peter Brooks. John woke up before Sarah, feeling restless. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the unopened laptop in front of him. The email from Peter Brooks was still there, waiting. He hadn't told Sarah about it. He didn't even know how to start that conversation. But now, as the early morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, John felt a sense of urgency. He needed to know what the email said. He needed to understand what was coming. The fear of the unknown was gnawing at him, and the longer he waited, the worse it got. He opened the laptop and logged into his email, his heart pounding. John stared at it for a long time, his finger hovering over the mouse. His future self had warned him not to open it. But what if the letter was wrong? What if this was just a harmless business offer? After a few deep breaths, he clicked it open. The email was simple. I'm involved in a new startup and have been following your work. We'd love to discuss a potential partnership. Let me know if you're interested. That was it. No grand promises, no threats. Just a business offer. But still, the weight of the letter pressed down on him, reminding him of the warning, don't accept the offer. John closed the email without replying, his mind swirling with questions. What should he do? Chapter 3. John tried to convince himself it was all just a coincidence, an innocent business offer with no connection to the cryptic letter he had found in the attic. John had closed the email without replying, but he couldn't get it out of his mind. Every time he sat down at his desk, his inbox seemed to taunt him. The unread message from Peter Brooks was a door left slightly ajar, inviting him to peek inside and see what lay beyond. But each time his finger hovered over the mouse, something stopped him. It was the warning. Decline it, no matter how tempting it seems. John had no idea what the consequences of accepting could be, but he wasn't eager to find out. He knew he had to push the thoughts of Brooks away, focus on his job and on Sarah. The baby was coming soon, and that should have been the only thing on his mind. But the letter and the email lingered, always just beneath the surface. Rumors of layoffs were swirling around the office, and John felt the anxiety building in the pit of his stomach. His manager, Claire, had been avoiding him for the past week, and each time she did speak with him, it was vague and filled with empty reassurances. John sat at his desk one morning, staring blankly at the stack of reports he was supposed to be reviewing. His phone buzzed with a notification, and for a split second, he feared it might be another message from Peter Brooks. But it wasn't. It was worse. Notice of foreclosure, urgent. John's heart sank as he opened the email. They were behind on the mortgage payments again. How could they have fallen so far behind? He thought he had everything under control, but the medical bills from Sarah's pregnancy were piling up faster than he could keep track of. Every doctor's visit, every test, each one seemed to drain a little more from their savings, and now they were teetering on the edge of losing the house. He buried his face in his hands, the pressure of it all weighing down on him. How had things gotten so bad? He felt like he was drowning, and every day, the water rose a little higher. It wasn't just the mortgage. The car needed repairs, and Sarah's job wouldn't cover all of her maternity leave. Everything was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how hard he tried to stay afloat, it felt like the world was crashing down around him. And then, there was Peter Brooks. A growing temptation that night, John lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The sound of Sarah's soft breathing beside him was usually comforting, but tonight it felt like a reminder of everything he was failing to protect. The house, the future they had dreamed about for their child, it was all on the line. He glanced over at Sarah, her hand resting gently on her growing belly. She was everything to him, and yet he couldn't bring himself to tell her how bad things had gotten. He hadn't told her about the foreclosure notice. He hadn't told her about the car repair bills or the possibility that he might lose his job. And, most of all, he hadn't told her about Peter Brooks. John slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and made his way downstairs. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the kitchen light. He poured himself a glass of water, but it did nothing to soothe the knot of anxiety in his chest. The laptop sat on the kitchen table, waiting for him. He hesitated, standing there in the silence, knowing what he was about to do. His future self had warned him not to take the offer, but that warning felt distant now, almost unreal. John sat down and opened his laptop, his hands shaking slightly as he clicked on the email from Brooks. He read the message again, his eyes lingering on the words, lucrative partnership. This wasn't just some consulting gig. Brooks was offering him something big, something that could pull him out of the mess he was in. The temptation was overwhelming. He started typing a reply. "I've received your offer and would like to discuss it further." Before he could finish the message, John froze. The knot in his chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. His mind flashed back to the letter in the attic. The warning was clear. This offer was dangerous. He still didn't understand why his future self would go to such lengths to warn him about this man. What could accepting this offer possibly lead to? He hesitated, his finger hovering over the send button. The thought of the foreclosure notice flashed in his mind, the image of Sarah's tired face, the baby that would be arriving soon. He couldn't let him down. He couldn't lose everything. And yet, something deep inside him told him to stop, to think, to wait. John deleted the email and shut the laptop. John walked into work, his mind still reeling from the night before. He had avoided making a decision, but the pressure was building. How long could he keep ignoring the offer? How long could he avoid telling Sarah the truth? As he made his way through the lobby, something caught his eye. A man was standing near the entrance, talking to one of the security guards. He was tall, well-dressed, with sharp features and dark hair. There was something about him that felt familiar, but John couldn't place it. As he passed by, the man's eyes met his for a brief second. A cold shiver ran down John's spine. He didn't know why, but there was something unsettling about the way the man looked at him, like he knew something John didn't. John continued walking, trying to shake off the feeling. It was probably nothing, just a stranger. But as he reached his office, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an unknown number. John's heart pounded as he opened the message. "We need to talk. Peter Brooks." John stared at the message, his hands trembling. Brooks wasn't waiting for a reply anymore. He had found him. John sat frozen at his desk, the message from Peter Brooks glaring up at him from his phone. "We need to talk." The text was simple but chilling. There was no escape now. Peter Brooks had found him. What was he supposed to do now? The warning in the letter still echoed in his mind. Decline it, no matter how tempting it seems. But everything around him was crumbling. His job was on shaky ground, Sarah was still recovering from her last doctor's visit, and the foreclosure notice was sitting in a pile of unopened bills on the kitchen counter. John glanced up at his co-workers, who were quietly typing away, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside him. No one knew the pressure he was under, the fear that every day could be the one when it all fell apart. No one knew about the letter, about Peter Brooks, or the impossible choice he was facing. His phone buzzed again. "John, call me when you can. We need to discuss the opportunity." John clenched his jaw, shutting the phone screen. He had never met Peter Brooks in person, but somehow Brooks had gotten his phone number, tracked him down. The urgency in the messages was unsettling. It felt like Brooks was watching his every move, waiting for him to crack. John could feel himself being pulled in two directions. The logical part of him screamed to ignore the messages, to heed the warning of the letter. But the other part, the desperate part, whispered that maybe Brooks was the solution to all his problems. His phone buzzed again, and this time, it wasn't Peter Brooks. It was Claire, his manager, summoning him to her office. The timing couldn't have been worse, but John pushed the phone into his pocket and hurried over to her office. Claire sat behind her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She gestured for him to sit down, her expression unreadable. John's heart pounded in his chest, his mind already racing to the worst-case scenario. "We need to talk," Claire said, her tone soft but firm. "There have been some changes happening within the company, as you know, and I wanted to give you a heads up." John swallowed hard, his palms sweating. "What kind of changes?" Claire glanced down at her desk for a moment before meeting his eyes again. "The firm is downsizing, and unfortunately, your position is being affected." John felt the air leave his lungs. It was as if everything he had feared was coming true all at once. "You're letting me go," Claire sighed. "It's not what I want, John. You've been a valuable member of the team, but this is out of my hands. The higher-ups made the decision. You'll have a few weeks to transition, but after that," her words trailed off, but John didn't need her to finish the sentence. He knew what it meant. He was losing his job. Everything he had worked for, the stability he had fought to maintain for his family, was slipping away. "I'm sorry," Claire added, her voice softer now, as if the apology could somehow make up for the devastation she had just delivered. John stood up slowly, his body feeling heavy, his mind numb. "Thanks for letting me know," he muttered, though the words felt empty. He left her office in a daze, his thoughts spiraling. A breaking point, John walked back to his desk, but the office now felt distant, surreal, like it wasn't even real anymore. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. What was he going to tell Sarah? How were they going to survive without his job? And what about the house? The baby? For the first time, he let himself think seriously about Peter Brooks' offer. Maybe this was his way out. Maybe the mysterious startup could offer him the financial security he needed. Brooks had been persistent, offering him a lucrative opportunity, and at this point, could he really afford to say no? The nagging thought of the letter tugged at him, warning him again not to take the offer. But that letter, whatever it was, didn't seem to understand how desperate things had gotten. John felt like he was drowning, and Brooks was holding out a life raft. That evening, John sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the stack of bills in front of him. The foreclosure notice was sitting on top, a bright red, urgent stamp glaring up at him. He hadn't told Sarah yet. The pregnancy complications, the extra doctor's visits, it was all taking a toll on her. He couldn't burden her with this too. The phone buzzed again, another message from Peter Brooks. "John, this opportunity won't last forever. I'm giving you the chance to change your life. Don't let it slip away." John stared at the message for a long time, his heart racing. The house, the baby, his job, everything was crumbling around him. Could this really be the answer? Could Peter Brooks offer him the solution he desperately needed? John lay awake beside Sarah, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. She had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's events. John, however, couldn't sleep. His mind was spinning, consumed by the weight of the decision he was being forced to make. Sarah deserved to know the truth about the foreclosure, the job situation, everything. But how could he tell her? How could he look into her eyes and admit that he had failed? In the darkness, John reached for her hand, holding it gently. Her fingers were warm and soft, her wedding ring cool against his skin. He remembered their wedding day, how happy they had been, how hopeful they had felt about the future. Now that future seemed so far away, slipping through his fingers like sand. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She didn't stir, still deep in sleep. John sighed, turning his gaze back to the ceiling. The next morning, over breakfast, John finally found the courage to tell her. "We're behind on the mortgage," he said quietly, unable to meet her eyes. "I got a notice of foreclosure." Sarah looked up from her plate, her expression shifting from confusion to worry. "What? How?" "The medical bills, the car repairs, we just fell behind," John explained, his voice breaking. "I thought I could catch up, but with work slowing down, it's been impossible." Sarah sat back, her face pale. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" John rubbed his face, feeling the weight of his lies crash down on him. "I didn't want to worry you. I thought I could fix it. And your job?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. John hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm losing it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah blinked, her eyes welling with tears. "John, why didn't you talk to me? We're supposed to be in this together." "I just didn't want to let you down," and stared at the message from Peter Brooks. His heart raced, his mind buzzing with uncertainty. The warning from the letter was clear: don't take the offer. Chapter 5. John stared at the message he had written to Peter Brooks, his finger trembling above the send button. Everything in his life had been leading to this moment. The crumbling foundation of his job, the foreclosure notice, and the medical bills had all pushed him to the brink. Sarah was upstairs, trying to sleep, unaware of the decision that could change everything. The warning from the letter echoed in his mind: decline it, no matter how tempting it seems. But what choice did he have? Could the consequences of accepting this offer really be worse than losing their home, their security? Could it be worse than letting down Sarah and their unborn child? He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow. His future self had known something about Peter Brooks, something he still didn't understand. But Peter Brooks wasn't just a man anymore, he was a symbol of the choices John had to make. Could he turn back from this point? He opened his eyes, staring at the words on the screen. He hovered over the send button one last time before finally clicking it. The email sent. John leaned back in his chair, his heart thudding in his chest. The silence of the house felt suffocating, and the weight of what he had just done settled over him like a heavy blanket. There was no turning back now. He had made his decision. And now all he had to do was wait. He found himself checking his phone constantly, waiting for Peter Brooks' response, though a part of him still hoped the email would somehow vanish into the ether and leave him free of this nightmare. But by mid-afternoon, the reply arrived. "John, I'm glad you've decided to move forward. Let's meet tomorrow to discuss the details in person. My office is at 451 Waverly Plaza, 10 a.m. sharp. Peter Brooks." John felt his stomach twist as he read the message. He had expected a phone call, maybe a conference, but Brooks wanted to meet face to face. Was this really happening? Was he about to walk into the very situation his future self had warned him against? He thought about ignoring the message, pretending he hadn't read it, but it was too late for that. He had already agreed to the meeting. Turning back now would only complicate things further. John dressed in his best suit, though it felt stiff and uncomfortable. He hadn't worn it in months, and it was a reminder of the life he had been struggling to maintain. He glanced at himself in the mirror, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. He didn't feel like the man who had everything under control anymore. He felt like someone teetering on the edge of a cliff. Sarah was still asleep when he left the house. He had written her a note, telling her he was going to a meeting and would be back by the afternoon. He didn't mention Peter Brooks or what this meeting was about. He couldn't bear to tell her, not yet. Not until he knew what the outcome would be. John arrived at 451 Waverly Plaza with time to spare. The building was sleek and modern, all glass and steel, looming over the city like a monument to success. As he entered the lobby, he felt out of place. The polished floors and pristine decor only heightened his anxiety. This world, Peter Brooks' world, was one he didn't belong to. The receptionist greeted him with a professional smile and directed him to the elevators. "Mr. Brooks is expecting you," she said, as if John had been in this building 100 times before. The ride up to the top floor felt endless. He tried to shake off the feeling, reminding himself that this was just a business meeting. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just business. It never had been. When the elevator doors opened, John stepped out into a lavish office space. The walls were lined with expensive artwork, and the furniture looked as though it had been custom-made for someone with far more wealth than John could ever imagine. At the end of the room, Peter Brooks stood by a large window, looking out over the city. "John," Brooks said, turning around with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm glad you could make it." John swallowed hard, nodding as he stepped forward. "Yeah, thanks for meeting with me." Brooks gestured to the chairs in front of his desk, and John sat down, trying to keep his nerves in check. Peter Brooks was a sharp-looking man, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. His eyes were intense, calculating, and John felt a shiver run down his spine as Brooks sat across from him. "So," Brooks began, leaning forward slightly. "You've decided to accept my offer." John nodded, though his throat felt tight. Brooks smiled, but there was something cold and mechanical about it. "Of course. I understand you have reservations. You're a smart man, you want to protect your family. That's why you're here." John's stomach tightened. The way Brooks said, "family," sent a chill through him. "I need to make sure this is the right decision for me and my wife." Brooks' smile widened, though it didn't seem genuine. "I assure you, this will solve all of your problems. Financial security, stability, it's all within your reach. But you must understand, once you accept, there's no going back." John swallowed hard, the warning from the letter flashing through his mind. "What exactly am I agreeing to?" Brooks leaned back in his chair, studying John with those cold eyes. "You're agreeing to a partnership. A very lucrative one, but it requires complete commitment. You'll be expected to make certain sacrifices." John's heart pounded. "Sacrifices? What kind of sacrifices?" Brooks' gaze didn't waver. "Time, energy, your loyalty. In return, you'll receive everything you need to secure your family's future." John sat back, his mind spinning. This felt wrong, everything about this felt wrong. But he had come this far. He had already made the decision to be here. Could he really turn back now? "I'll think about it," John said, his voice shaking slightly. Brooks' smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. "John, you've already made your decision by coming here. The offer won't last forever." John stood up, feeling lightheaded. "I just need some time." Brooks didn't stop him as he turned and headed for the elevator. But as the doors closed behind him, John couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Chapter 6, The Consequences. John walked out of the building, the weight of the conversation with Peter Brooks still pressing down on him. His head swirled with conflicting thoughts. The offer Brooks had presented seemed too good to be true, and the cryptic way he had spoken about sacrifices didn't sit well with John. It had all felt wrong. He hurried down the street, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at him, but the thoughts wouldn't go away. He had gone into that meeting looking for a solution, but now he felt like he had walked into something much darker. The letter from his future self flashed in his mind again. Decline it, no matter how tempting it seems. Had he already gone too far? He reached his car and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, his hands gripping it tightly. He hadn't officially agreed to anything. Not yet, but Peter Brooks was right. By walking into that office, by entertaining the offer, John had already taken the first step. Could he still back out? Could he undo what had been set into motion? His phone buzzed. It was Sarah. He let it go to voicemail. He couldn't face her right now. Not after what he had just done. The growing divide. When John finally returned home later that evening, Sarah was waiting for him at the kitchen table. She looked tired, her eyes heavy from a day spent worrying. She had been patient with him, but John knew her patience was wearing thin. "Where were you?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle but edged with concern. "I've been trying to call you. I had a meeting," John replied, taking a deep breath as he tried to steady himself. "You told me you were losing your job." John sat down across from her, his hands folded in his lap. He could feel the tension building between them. He hated that he had been keeping things from her, but how could he explain Peter Brooks without sounding insane? How could he tell her about the letter, about his future self's warning? "I found an opportunity," he said carefully, choosing his words. "A business offer. It could help us out, a lot." Sarah's expression softened, but her concern didn't disappear. "Is it a good opportunity? Are you sure about it?" John hesitated, the memory of Peter Brooks' cold eyes flashing in his mind. Was he sure? No, he wasn't. But the alternative, doing nothing, watching everything fall apart, felt even worse. "I think it could solve our problems," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence he wanted it to have. Sarah reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "John, I trust you. But please, if there's something wrong, if this isn't the right choice, you need to tell me." Her words stung. He wished he could tell her everything, but how could he burden her with this? She was already under enough stress with the baby coming, and he didn't want to add to that. Not when he could still fix it. He forced a smile. "I promise I'll be careful." Sarah nodded, though her eyes were still filled with worry. "Okay," she said softly. "But please, don't shut me out. We're in this together." John nodded, but the guilt in his chest only deepened. He had already shut her out. He had been doing it for weeks, ever since the letter had appeared in the attic. John tried to go through the motions, acting like everything was normal, but the pressure was building. Every night, he would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Peter Brooks in his mind. He hadn't told Sarah the full truth about the meeting, and that secret was eating away at him. He kept telling himself that he was protecting her, but the reality was that he was protecting himself, from the fear that he had made the wrong decision. A few days after the meeting, John received another email from Peter Brooks. This time, it was a formal contract. John opened the document, his eyes scanning the details, but the legal jargon blurred in front of him. The contract was full of vague promises, financial security, a high-paying role, benefits for his family, but there were also sections that made his stomach turn. The phrase, absolute loyalty, appeared more than once, and there were clauses about exclusive commitments and non-disclosure. John wasn't naive enough to think this was a normal business deal. This was something else. Something darker. But what was the alternative? If he didn't sign, they would lose the house. Sarah's medical bills were piling up. His severance package from work wasn't going to last much longer. John closed the contract without signing it, but the decision lingered in his mind. The warning returns one night, as John was sitting in the living room, trying to make sense of his options, there was a knock at the door. It was late, too late for visitors, and John's heart leapt in his chest. He stood up, glancing over at Sarah, who was asleep on the couch, and made his way to the door. He opened it cautiously, half expecting to see Peter Brooks standing there, but instead, there was no one. John frowned, stepping outside and looking around. His street was eerily quiet, not a soul in sight. He was about to turn back inside when something caught his eye. A small envelope had been placed on his doorstep. His stomach tightened as he bent down to pick it up. The envelope was identical to the one he had found in the attic, crisp, clean, with his own handwriting on the front. To John Scott, read carefully. John's hands shook as he tore the envelope open, pulling out the letter inside. His heart raced as he unfolded the paper, bracing himself for the words that would follow. "John," the letter began. "You've come too far. You didn't listen. I warned you, but you didn't listen. Now, things are about to get much worse." John's chest tightened, his breath coming in short gasps as he read the words. "Peter Brooks isn't who you think he is. This isn't just business. This is the beginning of something you can't stop. This is your last chance." John stood there, the letter trembling in his hands, his mind reeling. His future self had reached out to him again, but this time, the tone was different. It wasn't just a warning, it was a final plea. But leave everything behind. How could he do that? How could he explain that to Sarah? And what about the baby? Where would they even go? He looked around the empty street, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt like the walls were closing in around him, like the world had suddenly become smaller, more dangerous. John stuffed the letter into his pocket and stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. He had crossed a line, and now he wasn't sure if he could find his way back. His mind reeled from the new warning, the urgent plea to leave everything behind. Take Sarah. Leave everything behind. There's still time. His pulse raced as the words echoed in his head. Could he really just walk away from everything? How could he explain to Sarah that they needed to leave their entire lives behind, especially with the baby coming so soon? None of this made sense, and yet, deep down, John knew his future self wouldn't have reached out again if the danger wasn't real. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Sarah had gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from the pregnancy, oblivious to the storm that was raging inside John's mind. He glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight, and the darkness outside seemed to close in on him. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows through the windows. You didn't listen. Now things are about to get much worse. His phone buzzed, startling him out of his thoughts. He grabbed it off the table and saw a message from an unknown number. John, time's running out. You can't run forever, we'll be seeing you soon. John's heart skipped a beat. His hands trembled as he stared at the message. It wasn't from his future self, it was from Peter Brooks. The casual threat in the words sent a chill down his spine. He felt like a caged animal, trapped between a rock and a hard place. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps behind him made him jump. He turned around to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes filled with concern. John, what's going on? She asked softly. You're scaring me. John's heart sank. He hadn't heard her come downstairs, but now there was no hiding the truth from her. The worry in her eyes told him she had sensed something was wrong for a long time. He couldn't keep the secrets any longer. I'm sorry, John whispered, running a hand through his hair. I didn't want to drag you into this, but things have gotten out of control. Sarah took a tentative step forward, her eyes searching his. What do you mean? What's going on, John? John hesitated, his throat tight. He pulled out the letters, both of them, and handed them to her, his hands shaking as he did. These, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I got these, from the future. Sarah blinked, clearly taken aback, her brow furrowing as she glanced down at the letters. What do you mean, from the future? I don't know how to explain it, John said, his voice hoarse. But these letters, they're warnings. From my future self. I was supposed to turn down an offer from a man named Peter Brooks. But I didn't listen, and now, things are spiraling out of control. Sarah's face paled as she skimmed the letters, her hands trembling slightly. John, this can't be real. How can these letters be from the future? John let out a shaky breath, sitting down at the table. I don't know, I don't understand it either. But Peter Brooks, he's real, he found me, and now he's coming for us. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she sat down next to him. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't want to scare you, John admitted. I thought I could fix it on my own. But now, I don't know what to do. Sarah glanced at the letters again, her brow furrowed in thought. The second letter says we have to leave everything behind. Is that really the only option? John nodded slowly. I think so. I think if we stay, something terrible is going to happen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Sarah wiped away her tears and reached for John's hand. If leaving is the only way to keep us safe, she said quietly, then we'll leave. John stared at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and guilt. Are you sure? Sarah nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. You're my husband. If you believe this is real, then I believe you. We'll figure it out together. He didn't deserve her trust, not after everything he had kept from her, but now wasn't the time for self-pity. They had to act fast. The escape by dawn, they were packed. John moved swiftly, throwing clothes into a suitcase while Sarah gathered important documents and mementos. They loaded the car as the sun began to rise, casting an eerie glow over the empty streets. John glanced back at the house as they pulled out of the driveway. The place they had called home for so many years now felt like a trap. The walls had been closing in, and now they were finally breaking free. As they drove away, the tension between them slowly eased, though the fear still lingered. John checked the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see someone following him, but the roads remained empty. Sarah rested her hand on her belly, her face set in quiet resolve. "Where are we going?" she asked softly. John hesitated. "I don't know, somewhere far. We'll figure it out once we're out of the city." Sarah nodded, accepting the uncertainty with grace. She trusted him, even now, and that trust was the only thing keeping John from falling apart. The final message hours later, as they crossed into another state, John's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, expecting another message from Peter Brooks. But it wasn't. It was a single text, from an unknown number, just like before. "You did the right thing. You're safe now, for now." John let out a long breath, relief flooding through him. He looked over at Sarah, who was gazing out the window, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like they had a future, one that wasn't clouded by fear or uncertainty. But the final words of the message lingered in his mind. "For now."